Ma'am, step out of the vehicle now. The words cut clean through the quiet like a switch flipping, and for a second, even the wind seemed to hold its breath as red and blue lights washed over the black sedan parked on the side of the road, its polished surface catching flashes of color like a mirror that refused to tell the whole truth. And behind the wheel, Naomi Carter didn't move right away, her hands resting lightly at 10 and 2, steady, deliberate, as if the world outside the glass couldn't rush her, as if time itself had learned to wait for her to decide what came next. And Officer Daniel Hayes shifted his stance just enough for the leather on his duty belt to creak, impatience flickering across his face in the reflection of the window, because from where he stood, this didn't add up. Not the car, not the quiet, not the woman inside who didn't look nervous enough, not even close. And that bothered him more than anything, because he was used to tells, to hesitation, to voices that cracked just a little under pressure. But Naomi's silence wasn't fear. It was something else, something measured, something that didn't ask for permission to exist, and the street behind them had begun to gather witnesses without meaning to. A couple on the sidewalk slowing their pace. A teenager pausing mid-step with his phone halfway raised. The soft hum of a nearby engine idling, as if even it didn't want to interrupt what was unfolding, and Hayes stepped closer, tapping twice on the glass. Firm, controlled, the sound dull but sharp enough to carry meaning. I said step out of the car, he repeated, slower this time, like clarity could replace doubt. And finally Naomi turned her head, just slightly, her eyes meeting his through the reflection of flashing lights, calm, unreadable, the kind of gaze that didn't rise to meet tension because it didn't recognize it as authority. And when she opened the door, it wasn't rushed or hesitant, just precise, the hinges moving without a sound as her feet met the pavement. Steady in low heels that clicked once, softly, against the asphalt, and for a moment the space between them felt thinner, like something unseen had shifted. But Hayes didn't step back. He couldn't. Not now. Not with eyes on him. Not with the story already forming in his head. And he gestured toward the hood of the car, not aggressively, just enough to make the expectation clear. We're going to sort this out, he said, though his tone carried less certainty than he intended. And Naomi placed her hands lightly where he indicated, cool metal under her palms, the chill of it pressing through her skin as the lights continued to pulse across her face, highlighting the small details most people missed, the faint line near her wrist, the posture that didn't bend under pressure, the stillness that wasn't submission but control. And somewhere behind them, a radio crackled, a voice asking for status, routine words that suddenly felt too small for the moment, too ordinary for something that wasn't supposed to be happening like this. And Hayes exhaled slowly, steadying himself, because from his side of the badge, this was simple. It had to be simple, and yet nothing about her felt simple at all. And as the sirens faded into a quieter rhythm, Naomi finally spoke, her voice low, even, carrying just far enough to reach him without needing to rise. Officer, she said, not confrontational, not afraid, just certain. You're making a mistake. And the words didn't echo, didn't demand attention, but they stayed, settling into the space between them like something that refused to move. And for the first time since the lights came on, Hayes hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before pushing forward, as if hesitation itself was something he could outrun. The metal beneath her palms held the night's chill, steady and unyielding. But Naomi Carter did not shift her weight or pull back as the wind moved lightly across the open stretch of road, carrying the faint scent of asphalt and distant traffic. And somewhere behind her a car passed slower than necessary, the driver turning just enough to look, to witness, to remember. While Officer Hayes adjusted his grip on the situation more than anything else, his fingers brushing the edge of the cuffs at his belt, not rushing, just preparing, because preparation meant control and control meant clarity. At least that was how it had always worked before tonight. License and registration, he said, his voice flatter now, more procedural, like stepping into a script he trusted. And Naomi turned her head slightly, enough for her voice to carry without raising it. It is in the glove compartment, she replied, calm, precise, each word placed exactly where it needed to be. And for a brief second Hayes hesitated again, not because of what she said but how she said it. No tremor, no apology, just information. and Sergeant Luke Morris, standing a few feet back with his arms crossed, gave a subtle nod that said move forward. Keep it simple. Do not overthink it. So Hayes stepped closer, opening the passenger side door himself, the interior light flickering on to reveal a cabin that was almost too clean, too ordered, nothing out of place, no clutter, no distraction, just a quiet kind of discipline that did not match the story forming in his mind. And as he retrieved the documents, his eyes scanned quickly, practiced, searching for the detail that would anchor everything in a certainty. But the name did not register the way it should have, not yet, because context had not caught up, and he closed the door with a soft push, returning to the front of the vehicle where Naomi remained exactly as she had been, unmoved by the shifting energy around her. Step back, he said, more out of habit than necessity. And she complied without resistance. One small step, heels clicking once against the pavement, the sound sharp in the otherwise controlled quiet, and Morris moved in closer now, his presence heavier, more authoritative, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being listened to. Where are you headed tonight? He asked, not really a question, but an opening. And Naomi met his gaze briefly, not challenging, just direct. Home, she said, and the simplicity of it seemed to irritate something unseen, because simplicity left no room to push, no angle to press against, and Hayes cleared his throat, flipping the license open again as if the answer might change if he looked long enough. This vehicle is registered under a different address, he said, testing the edge of doubt, and Naomi nodded once. Temporary assignment, she replied, and again there was no extra explanation, no effort to fill the silence, and that silence began to stretch, thin but noticeable, like a thread pulling tighter between them, and behind them the radio crackled again, dispatch asking for an update, the voice routine, unaware of the subtle shift taking place on the roadside. We have a situation, Hayes responded, choosing the words carefully, not fully committing but not stepping back either, and Morris exhaled slowly, glancing toward Naomi with a look that measured more than it judged. Ma'am, we are going to need you to come with us so we can verify some details, he said, tone firm but not raised, and Naomi's expression did not change, but something in the stillness deepened, like a decision settling into place. Is that necessary? She asked, not argumentative, just exact, and Morris held her gaze for a second longer than before. It is procedure, he answered, and procedure hung in the air like a shield neither of them fully believed in. And Hayes stepped forward, the faint sound of metal shifting as he reached for the cuffs, the gesture controlled, deliberate, and Naomi did not pull away, did not resist. She simply turned slightly, offering her wrists with the same quiet precision she had carried from the beginning. And as the cool metal closed around them with a soft click, the sound felt louder than it should have, not because of force, but because of meaning, and for a moment even Hayes seemed to register it, his eyes flicking to her face as if expecting something to change, some reaction, some crack in the calm. But there was nothing, just that same steady presence, grounded, unshaken, and the teenager across the street lowered his phone slightly, unsure now of what he was capturing, because this did not feel like what it was supposed to be. And as Naomi was guided toward the patrol car, her steps even, measured, the red and blue lights continued to pulse against the night. But something about the rhythm had shifted, slower somehow, heavier, like the moment itself was waiting for something else to happen, something no one on that road was fully prepared to understand. The back door of the patrol car opened with a muted click that felt quieter than it should have, and Naomi Carter lowered herself into the seat without hesitation, her movements controlled, almost deliberate, as if she had stepped into situations like this before, though not like this, not exactly like this. And the interior smelled faintly of vinyl and something sterile, something that erased traces of whoever had been there before. And as the door closed behind her, the outside world narrowed to filtered flashes of red and blue slipping through the reinforced glass, painting brief patterns across her face that never stayed long enough to settle. While Officer Hayes walked around to the driver's side, his steps measured but just a fraction heavier than before, as if the ground itself had shifted under him in a way he could not name, and Sergeant Morris paused near the front of the car, speaking quietly into his radio, his voice low, controlled, the kind that carried authority without needing to push. But even from inside, Naomi could hear the slight change in cadence, the almost imperceptible tightening that came when something did not quite align, and across the street the small cluster of onlookers had thinned, the moment losing its spectacle as routine resumed its quiet hold. Yet something lingered, something unspoken that had not resolved itself, and Hayes slid into the driver's seat, the engine turning over with a steady hum as he adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes catching Naomi's reflection for just a second longer than necessary. Not confrontational, not curious, just searching, as if trying to place her within a narrative that still made sense to him. "We are taking you to the station," he said, the words sounding more like confirmation than instruction, and Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without adding anything to it, her hands resting lightly in her lap despite the cuffs, her posture unchanged, unaffected by the shift in setting, and the car eased back onto the road, tires rolling over the asphalt with a soft, consistent rhythm that filled the silence between them, while streetlights passed overhead one by one, casting brief, measured shadows that moved across the interior like a quiet countdown, and Hayes cleared his throat once, almost involuntarily, before speaking again. "You said temporary assignment," he began, his voice attempting neutrality. "What kind of assignment?" And Naomi's gaze remained forward, steady, as if the answer existed independently of his understanding. "Government," she replied, the words simple, unembellished, yet it settled. Differently this time, heavier, like a piece of a larger structure that had not yet been revealed, and Hayes let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh, not quite dismissal, just uncertainty finding a place to sit. "That is pretty broad," he said, glancing once more into the mirror, and Naomi's expression did not change. "It is meant to be," she answered, and the silence that followed stretched longer now. No longer empty but filled with something unspoken, something that resisted easy definition, and Morris's voice came through the radio again, clearer this time, asking for confirmation on the vehicle identification, and Hayes reached for the mic, repeating the details with careful precision, as if accuracy might restore the balance he felt slipping, and for a moment there was only static in response. A brief pause that lasted just long enough to be noticed before dispatch replied with a tone that was almost too neutral, almost too measured. "Stand by," the voice said, and those two words carried more weight than they should have, hanging in the air like a door not fully opened, and Hayes's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, the leather creasing under his fingers, while Naomi remained still, her breathing even, her presence unchanged, as if she had already moved beyond this moment in ways no one else in the car could see. And outside, the city shifted subtly as they drove, familiar streets giving way to the quiet order of the precinct. Ahead, its lights steady, unblinking, a place built on structure and certainty. Yet as the patrol car pulled into the lot and slowed to a stop, the engine idling softly, there was a brief second where nothing moved, where the world seemed to pause just before the next step. And in that pause, Hayes looked at Naomi again through the mirror, searching once more for something that would make this simple, something that would bring the situation back into focus. But all he found was the same calm reflection staring back, unshaken, unwavering, and for reasons he could not explain, that unsettled him more than anything that had happened so far. The engine idled for a moment longer than necessary, a low, steady vibration that seemed to echo the tension settling into the space between them. And when Officer Hayes finally turned the key and the sound faded, the silence that followed felt heavier, more deliberate, as if the building ahead had been waiting for them to arrive, its fluorescent lights casting a pale glow across the parking lot that erased shadows but not uncertainty. And Sergeant Morris stepped out first, closing his door, with a controlled motion before walking around the front of the vehicle, his posture straight, his pace unhurried, the kind of movement that suggested routine. Yet his eyes flicked once toward the rear of the car, measuring, recalculating something that had not been there at the start of the night. While Hayes remained seated for a second longer, hands resting on the steering wheel, fingers still curled as if he had not yet decided to let go. And when he finally opened his door, the cool air met him with a clarity that did nothing to settle the quiet shift inside his chest, and he moved to the back, opening Naomi's door without a word, the hinges releasing with a soft mechanical sound that seemed louder in the stillness. And Naomi stepped out smoothly, her heels meeting the concrete with that same precise rhythm, unbroken, unaffected, as if the location had changed but the moment had not. And for a brief second, under the harsh overhead lights, the details became sharper, the line of her posture, the steadiness of her gaze, the way she carried herself not as someone being processed, but as someone passing through, and Hayes gestured toward the entrance. "This way," he said, the words quieter now, less edged, and Naomi moved forward without hesitation. The cuffs still in place, but not defining her movement, just existing as a detail that had yet to find its meaning, and the glass doors slid open with a muted hum, releasing a wave of cool, conditioned air that carried the faint scent of paper, coffee, and something institutional, something that belonged to systems and structure. And inside, the station was exactly what it always was, a series of desks, low conversations, the distant sound of a printer feeding out pages, officers moving through their routines with practiced ease. But as Naomi stepped in, something subtle shifted, not enough to stop anything outright, just enough to slow it. A glance held a fraction longer, a conversation trailing off mid-sentence, the kind of ripple that moved quietly but could not be ignored, and Morris led the way toward the processing desk, nodding once to the officer behind it, a younger man whose eyes flicked from Morris to Naomi and back again, uncertainty crossing his face before settling into neutrality. "We need to run verification," Morris said, his tone clipped, professional, and the officer nodded, reaching for the terminal, fingers hovering over the keyboard for a second before beginning to type, the soft clicking of keys filling the space between words. And Naomi stood still, her presence contained but undeniable, her gaze moving briefly across the room, not searching, not reacting, just observing, as if taking note of details that would matter later. And Hayes remained a step behind, watching, his earlier certainty now threaded with something quieter, something less defined. As the officer at the terminal paused mid-input, his brow tightening slightly as he leaned closer to the screen, reading, then rereading, as if the information in front of him did not match the expectation he had brought into the moment, and he cleared his throat softly, glancing up at Morris. "Sir," he began, then stopped, choosing his words more carefully. "There is a flag on this record," and Morris's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened. "What kind of flag?" he asked, and the officer hesitated, eyes returning to the screen. "Restricted clearance," he said finally, the words quiet but precise, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow, the background noise fading just enough for that phrase to settle fully. And Hayes shifted his weight, the sound of his boots against the tile floor suddenly louder than before, while Naomi remained exactly as she had been, composed, her breathing even, her presence steady, as if the information now surfacing had already been accounted for long before anyone else in the room had noticed. And Morris exhaled slowly, his gaze moving to Naomi, holding there for a second longer than before, something unspoken passing through that look. Not yet recognition, not yet understanding, but something closer to it than anything that had come before. And the officer at the terminal swallowed once, glancing between them, waiting for direction, while the fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, constant, indifferent, illuminating a moment that was beginning to shift in ways none of them could fully control. The words restricted clearance did not disappear after they were spoken. They stayed in the air like something misplaced in the wrong room, and the young officer at the terminal shifted in his seat, his fingers hovering above the keyboard as if he was unsure whether to continue or step back, while Sergeant Morris leaned slightly closer, not aggressively, just enough to see the screen for himself, the glow reflecting faintly in his eyes as he scanned the lines of text that were never meant to be accessed casually. And for the first time that night his jaw tightened, not in anger but in calculation, as if something had just moved outside the boundaries of routine procedure. "Run it again," he said quietly, and the officer nodded, swallowing once before re-entering the query, the keys clicking faster now, the rhythm uneven, betraying a tension he had not yet learned to hide. And Naomi Carter stood a few feet away, her hands still cuffed, her posture unchanged, her gaze calm but attentive, not fixed on the screen, not fixed on them, just present, as if she had already seen this moment play out before it happened. And Officer Hayes remained where he was, one step behind, his arms now loosely crossed, not defensive, not relaxed, just searching for a position that made sense in a situation that no longer followed the pattern he expected. And when the system responded again, the result did not change. If anything, it became clearer, more defined, a structured wall of information marked with access limitations that did not belong in a standard traffic stop. And the officer's voice came softer this time, more careful. "It is the same, sir," he said, and Morris exhaled slowly through his nose, his eyes not leaving the screen. "Details," he said, a single word that carried weight, and the officer hesitated, glancing once at Naomi before looking back down. "The record is partially sealed," he explained, choosing each word as if it might trigger something. "It references federal jurisdiction, high-level clearance, and," he paused, his voice dropping slightly, "command designation." And the last phrase seemed to land differently. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise, like a key turning quietly in a lock. And Hayes shifted his stance again, his boots pressing against the tile floor with a faint scrape that broke the silence for a second. "That does not make sense," he said, more to himself than anyone else. But the words hung there anyway, and Morris finally straightened, turning his attention from the screen to Naomi, studying her now with a focus that had changed, no longer dismissive, no longer procedural, but searching for alignment between what he was seeing and what he had assumed. "Ma'am," he began, his tone controlled but altered, "is there something you would like to clarify?" And Naomi met his gaze fully this time, her expression steady, composed, carrying a quiet certainty that did not need to prove itself. "I already did," she said, her voice even, measured, and for a brief moment no one spoke. The hum of the fluorescent lights filling the gap, the distant murmur of conversation at the far end of the station continuing, as if untouched by what was unfolding here. And then the radio at Morris's shoulder crackled again, sharper this time. Dispatch calling for an update. The voice carrying a note that had not been there earlier, a subtle urgency shaped by incomplete information, and Morris reached for it, pressing the button with a controlled motion. "Stand by," he replied, echoing the same words that had started this shift on the road. But now they felt different, heavier, as if they carried consequences instead of delay. And Hayes glanced toward the door briefly, then back at Naomi, his earlier confidence now replaced by something quieter, something closer to doubt, not fully formed but impossible to ignore. And the young officer at the terminal leaned back slightly, hands lowering to his lap as if the system itself had told him to stop. And for a second the room felt suspended, caught between action and realization, until Naomi spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. "I would like to make a call," she said, and the request did not sound like a plea or a demand. It sounded like the next step in a process only she fully understood. And Morris held her gaze for a long second, weighing something that had shifted beyond policy, beyond assumption, before nodding once, slow, deliberate. "You will get your call," he said, and the words landed with a weight none of them had expected when the night began, as if the direction of everything had just changed, quietly, without permission, and without any way to turn it back. The request did not echo through the room. It settled, quiet but undeniable, and for a moment no one moved, as if the simple act of asking had shifted something deeper than procedure. And Sergeant Morris turned slightly, glancing toward the holding area phone mounted on the far wall, then back to Naomi Carter, measuring not just her words but the way she stood, the way she waited without impatience, as if time itself was aligned with her rather than against her. And Officer Hayes exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the low hum of the overhead lights, his earlier certainty now replaced by a steady awareness that something had moved beyond his control, though he could not yet define what it was. And Morris gave a small nod toward the officer at the terminal. "Remove the restraints," he said, his tone even, not loud, but it carried a subtle shift that everyone in the immediate space felt. And the younger officer hesitated for just a fraction of a second before stepping forward, his hands careful, precise, unlocking the cuffs with a soft metallic click that seemed louder than it should have been. And as Naomi's wrists were freed, she did not rub them or react. She simply lowered her hands naturally to her sides, as if nothing had been taken from her and nothing had been returned, just a transition from one state to another. And she stepped forward at Morris's gesture, moving toward The phone with the same measured pace she had carried since the roadside, her heels marking a quiet rhythm against the tile floor that seemed to guide the attention of everyone within earshot. And even those who had not been part of the situation now found themselves watching without fully understanding why. Conversations softening, movements slowing, as if something unseen had begun to take shape in the room. And Naomi reached the phone, lifting the receiver with a steady hand, the coiled cord stretching slightly as she brought it to her ear. And for a second she did not speak. She listened, the faint dial tone filling the space between her and the world beyond the station. And Hayes shifted his weight again, his eyes fixed not on her face, but on the details, the way her shoulders remained relaxed, the way her breathing stayed even, the absence of urgency in a moment that should have carried it. And that absence unsettled him more than anything else had so far. And Morris stood a few feet back, arms no longer crossed, his posture open but alert, as if he had stepped into a different role without being told. And Naomi pressed the first number, then the next, each tone clear, deliberate, echoing softly in the quiet. And the sequence did not match anything familiar to those listening. Not a local line, not a standard contact, something longer, more structured. And when the line connected, the shift was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle change in the air, like pressure adjusting in a sealed room. And Naomi's voice came through calm and precise. "This is General Naomi Carter," she said, each word placed with clarity, without emphasis, without hesitation, and the title did not rise. It settled, like something that had always been true regardless of whether it had been acknowledged. And for a fraction of a second no one reacted, as if the meaning had not yet caught up with the sound. And then Hayes's eyes flicked to Morris, searching, while the young officer at the terminal leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Naomi, as if seeing her for the first time. And on the other end of the line, a voice responded, too faint to fully hear, but clear enough in tone, the kind that carried structure, recognition, authority that did not question itself. And Naomi listened again, her expression unchanged, then spoke once more. "I am currently at a local precinct," she said. "There has been a misunderstanding." And the word misunderstanding did not sound like a complaint. It sounded like a statement of fact, something that would be corrected rather than argued. And Morris took a slow breath, the realization beginning to settle into place piece by piece. Not fully formed but no longer avoidable. And Hayes felt it too, that quiet shift from control to observation, from assumption to awareness. And the room, still lit by the same steady fluorescent glow, no longer felt the same as it had moments before, because something had changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but fundamentally, and no one in that space could pretend otherwise any longer. The voice on the other end did not ask her to repeat herself. It did not question the name or the title. It shifted instantly, the tone sharpening into recognition that carried through the receiver even without volume. And Naomi Carter listened without moving, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, as if the confirmation had already existed long before the call was made. And for a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the line and the distant murmur of officers continuing their routines at half pace, unaware or unwilling to fully acknowledge what was unfolding just a few feet away. And then Naomi spoke again, calm, precise. "Yes, I am at the station on Westbrook Avenue," she said, her voice neither defensive nor urgent, just factual. And as she gave the location, Sergeant Morris felt something settle in his chest. Not panic, not yet, but a realization that this moment had moved beyond his authority in a way he could not reverse. And Officer Hayes stood a step back, his arms now lowered at his sides, his attention fixed entirely on Naomi. The earlier narrative he had built dissolving piece by piece as the weight of her words began to take form. And across the room the young officer at the terminal leaned forward again, his screen still displaying restricted access. Notices that no longer felt like anomalies but confirmations. And Naomi paused, listening once more, her head tilting slightly as the voice on the line continued. Faster now, more structured, the cadence of coordination already in motion, and she responded with a single word, "Understood," before lowering the receiver just enough to end the call without hesitation. The soft click of it returning to its cradle echoing faintly in the sudden stillness. And for a second no one spoke, as if the room itself needed time to adjust to what had just happened. And then Morris stepped forward, his voice controlled but carrying a subtle edge that had not been there before. "Ma'am," he said, choosing the word carefully now. "Is there anything we should be aware of?" And Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, her gaze meeting his fully, steady, unshaken. "Only that this will be addressed," she replied. And the simplicity of the statement landed heavier than any raised voice could have, because it did not threaten, it did not accuse. It simply stated a reality that had already begun to move into place. And Hayes shifted his stance again, his boots pressing softly against the tile, his eyes flicking toward the entrance of the station as if expecting something to happen, something immediate. But nothing did, not yet, and that waiting became its own kind of pressure, stretching the seconds longer than they should have been. And the radio at Morris's shoulder crackled again, this time louder, sharper, dispatch calling his name directly, the tone unmistakably different, and Morris reached for it quickly, pressing the button with a steadiness that masked the shift in his focus. "Morris," he answered, and the voice that came through was no longer routine. It carried urgency shaped by information he did not yet have. "Sergeant, we have been contacted by a federal office regarding an individual at your location," the dispatcher said, each word deliberate, and Morris's gaze moved immediately to Naomi, the connection forming fully now. "Undeniable, stand by," he replied, but the words felt smaller this time, less certain, as if the situation had already moved beyond the ability to pause it. And Naomi remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her presence unchanged, as if the confirmation now arriving externally was simply aligning with what had always been true. And Hayes felt it then, not as a thought, but as a shift, a quiet recognition that the moment they had stepped into earlier was no longer theirs to control, and that realization settled in the space between them, unspoken but clear, as the station lights continued to hum overhead, illuminating a scene that had already begun to change in ways none of them could stop. The word federal did not leave the radio easily. It lingered in the air even after the transmission ended, like something that carried weight beyond its syllables, and Sergeant Morris kept the device close to his shoulder for a second longer than necessary, as if expecting more, as if waiting for clarification that would somehow bring the situation back within reach, but none came, and that absence said enough. And across from him, Naomi Carter remained exactly as she had been, her posture steady, her gaze calm, not fixed on anyone in particular, but present in a way that made avoidance impossible. And Officer Hayes felt the shift deepen, not sudden, not dramatic, but undeniable, like a line had been crossed without anyone noticing when it happened. And he glanced toward the terminal again, the words "restricted clearance" still visible on the screen. No longer an anomaly, but a confirmation that had been ignored too long, and the young officer at the desk straightened in his chair, his earlier uncertainty now replaced by something closer to alertness, his eyes moving between Morris and Naomi, as if trying to understand how to respond to a situation that no longer fit training or routine. And Morris finally lowered the radio, his expression controlled but altered, his focus narrowing as he stepped closer to Naomi. Not in authority now, but in recognition. "Ma'am," he said again, the words settling differently this time. "We have been contacted," and he paused for a fraction of a second, choosing what came next with care, "by a federal office." And Naomi gave a slight nod, not surprised, not satisfied, just acknowledging the progression of events as they aligned with expectation. "They will," she said quietly, "follow through." And the certainty in her voice did not rise. It grounded itself, as if it had always been there waiting to be heard. And Hayes felt something tighten in his chest, not fear exactly, but the realization that the moment had shifted beyond explanation, that the assumptions he had carried onto the roadside had dissolved completely, leaving only the present, unfiltered, and as if responding to that realization, the front doors of the station opened again, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to draw attention. And a man stepped inside wearing a dark suit that did not belong to the rhythm of the room, his presence immediately distinct not because of movement, but because of stillness, the kind that did not need to announce itself. And conversations nearby softened further, officers glancing up briefly before returning to their tasks with a subtle awareness that something had changed, and the man moved toward the front desk with measured steps, his gaze scanning once, precise, until it settled on Naomi. And for a brief moment the entire room seemed to narrow to that line of sight, and Morris turned slightly, following the direction, his posture shifting again, not retreating but adjusting, as if preparing for a role he had not expected to play tonight. And Hayes remained where he was. But his stance had changed, the edges softened, the certainty replaced by observation, and the man stopped a few feet away, his voice calm, controlled, carrying authority without volume. "General Carter," he said, and the name landed fully this time, not as a possibility but as confirmation, and Naomi met his gaze with the same steady composure. "You are late," she replied, her tone even, not accusatory, just factual, and the man inclined his head slightly. "There was traffic," he said, a simple response that carried more than it revealed, and Morris took a slow breath, the reality settling in completely now, undeniable, and he straightened, his voice measured but respectful. "Sir," he said, addressing the man, "we were in the process of verifying," and the man raised a hand slightly, not interrupting, just pausing the explanation before it could fully form. "That will not be necessary," he said, and the finality in his tone did not need reinforcement, and Hayes looked between them, the shift now complete, the structure he had relied on replaced by something far larger, something that had been present all along but only now fully visible. And as the station lights continued their steady hum, illuminating every detail with indifferent clarity, the realization settled into every corner of the room, quiet but absolute, that the moment had changed direction, and there was no returning to what it had been before. The words "that will not be necessary" did not end the moment. They expanded it, stretching the silence across the room in a way that made every small sound sharper, clearer, more deliberate, and Sergeant Morris felt the shift settle fully into place, not as confusion anymore, but as understanding that had arrived too late to prevent what had already happened, and he straightened slightly, not out of authority, but out of instinct, adjusting his posture to meet a reality that no longer belonged to him. While Officer Hayes remained still, his earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet awareness that sat heavy in his chest, his eyes moving once more to Naomi Carter, seeing her now not as a subject of procedure, but as the center of something far larger than the station itself. And the man in the dark suit stepped closer, his movements measured, his presence controlled in a way that did not need to be announced. And when he reached Naomi, he stopped just short of formal distance, his voice low but clear. "General, we have been trying to reach you," he said, and Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging without apology. "I was occupied," she replied, her tone even, and the simplicity of the exchange carried a weight that settled over everyone listening, because there was no tension in it, no urgency, just alignment, as if 2 points had finally connected after a delay that no longer mattered. And the man nodded once, turning slightly toward Morris and Hayes, his gaze steady, evaluating without hostility, but without softness either. "I assumed there was a misunderstanding," he said, and Morris took a slow breath before responding, his voice controlled. "Yes, sir," he said. The words are coming naturally now, stripped of hesitation. "We initiated a stop based on vehicle registration discrepancy and proceeded according to protocol." And as he spoke, the explanation sounded thinner than it had moments before, like a structure that no longer supported its own weight. And the man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, and when Morris finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that allowed the meaning to settle fully before anything else could be added. "Protocol is not immunity," the man said quietly, and the statement did not rise. It did not accuse. It simply existed as a boundary that had already been crossed, and Hayes felt it then, not as a direct accusation, but as a realization, a clear and steady awareness that the situation had moved into consequences, not loud, not immediate, but certain, and he shifted his stance slightly, the sound of his boots against the tile almost too loud in the stillness. And Naomi remained where she was, her hands relaxed, her gaze steady, not focused on the officers now, but on the man who had arrived, as if the next steps belonged to a different layer entirely. And across the room, the younger officer at the terminal sat perfectly still, his earlier movements gone, replaced by a careful stillness that came from understanding that anything done now would matter. And the radio at Morris's shoulder crackled again. But he did not reach for it this time, not immediately, because the moment in front of him had taken precedence over anything else. And the man in the suit turned slightly, addressing Naomi again. "Transportation is waiting," he said, and she nodded once, a small movement that carried finality. And as she stepped forward, passing between Morris and Hayes, her heels marking that same steady rhythm against the tile, neither officer moved to stop her, neither spoke, because there was nothing left to assert, nothing left to question. And as she reached the doors, the man followed a step behind, his presence quiet but absolute, and the glass panels slid open with the same muted sound as before, releasing the night air back into the station for just a second. And in that moment, Hayes looked at Morris, not for instruction, but for confirmation of something neither of them wanted to say out loud. And Morris met his gaze briefly, the answer already there, unspoken. And then Naomi was outside, the doors closing behind her with a soft final click, leaving the station exactly as it had been, the lights still humming, the desks still occupied. But something fundamental had shifted, something that would not be undone. And for the first time since the night began, the silence that followed did not feel temporary. It felt like the beginning of something else entirely. The doors closed behind her with a quiet seal that seemed to divide the night into two different worlds. And for a few seconds no one inside the station moved, as if the air itself had thickened, holding everything in place. And Officer Hayes remained where he stood, his gaze still fixed on the glass as though it might open again, as though something could be undone if he waited long enough. But nothing happened, only the steady reflection of fluorescent light against the surface. And Sergeant Morris exhaled slowly, the breath controlled but heavier than before, his posture still upright, yet no longer anchored in certainty. And the man in the dark suit did not return, did not look back, because whatever had just occurred had already moved beyond explanation. And outside, Naomi Carter stepped into a waiting black vehicle that had arrived without announcement, its engine already running, its presence quiet but unmistakable. And as the door closed behind her, the car pulled away with a smooth, controlled motion, disappearing into the night as if it had never been there at all. And inside the station the silence finally broke, not with loud voices but with small movements, a chair shifting, a keyboard tapping, the ordinary sounds of routine attempting to reclaim the space. But they did not land the same way anymore. They felt thinner, less certain, like echoes of something that had already changed. And Hayes ran a hand briefly along the back of his neck, the gesture small but revealing, as if he was trying to reconnect with the version of himself that had stepped onto the roadside earlier. But that version did not quite fit anymore. And he turned toward Morris, his voice lower than usual. "What just happened?" he asked, not expecting a full answer, but needing something to hold on to. And Morris did not respond immediately, his eyes still on the closed doors, his mind moving through the sequence of events piece by piece, aligning details that now carried different weight. And when he finally spoke, his voice was measured, deliberate. "We followed protocol," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded incomplete, like a statement that no longer covered what had taken place. And Hayes nodded once, though the motion lacked conviction, and across the room the younger officer at the terminal began typing again, his movements slower now, more careful, pulling up records, cross-checking information that had already confirmed itself, as if repetition might restore clarity. But each line on the screen only reinforced the same reality, that something had been missed, not because it was hidden, but because it had not been recognized. And the radio at Morris's shoulder crackled again, this time with a sharper tone, dispatch calling him directly, and he reached for it without hesitation, pressing the button. "Morris," he said, his voice steady, and the response came quickly, structured. "Official. Sergeant, you are to remain available for immediate review regarding the incident that occurred at your location." And the phrasing was precise, controlled, but it carried something unmistakable beneath it, not anger, not accusation, but process. And process meant movement, and movement meant consequence. And Morris listened without interruption, his jaw tightening just slightly as the message concluded. "Understood," he replied, releasing the button slowly. and for a moment he did not lower the radio. He simply held it there, as if the weight of it had changed, and Hayes watched him, the realization settling deeper now. No longer abstract, no longer distant, but immediate. Review, he repeated. Quietly, the word landing heavier than expected, and Morris finally lowered the radio. Turning toward him, his expression composed but no longer neutral. "This is not over," he said, and the statement did not need emphasis. It did not need explanation, because everything in the room already pointed to it. And Hayes nodded again, slower this time, his gaze drifting briefly toward the terminal where the restricted clearance flag still glowed on the screen, a silent reminder of the moment that had shifted everything. And around them the station continued its routine, officers moving, phones ringing, reports being filed. But beneath it all there was a quiet awareness that had not been there before, something subtle but persistent, like a question that had not yet been answered. And as the minutes passed, the weight of that question settled into every corner of the room, not loud, not immediate, but certain, because the night had changed direction, and there was no way to return to where it had begun. The word review did not fade as the minutes passed. It settled deeper into the structure of the room, threading itself through every quiet movement and every measured breath. And Sergeant Morris stood near the front desk with his hands resting lightly at his sides, no longer commanding the space but existing within it, aware now of a shift that could not be reversed by explanation or routine. And Officer Hayes moved slowly toward the terminal, his steps quieter than before, as if the sound itself might carry meaning. And when he stopped beside the younger officer, he did not speak immediately, his eyes scanning the screen again, reading lines he had already seen, each word reinforcing the same realization that had begun on the roadside and now fully settled into place. And the younger officer glanced up briefly, his expression cautious, waiting for instruction that did not come, and Hayes finally exhaled, a controlled breath that did little to release the weight building in his chest. "Pull everything," he said, his voice low, steady, and the officer nodded, fingers moving across the keyboard with renewed precision, accessing logs, timestamps, every recorded detail of the encounter. And as the information populated the screen, it did not feel like evidence. It felt like a record of something that had already crossed into consequence. And across the room a senior lieutenant stepped out of an office, his presence immediately shifting the tone, not louder, not more forceful, just focused, and his gaze moved quickly across the space before settling on Morris. "In my office," he said, the words simple but direct, and Morris nodded once, turning without hesitation, his posture straight but carrying a quiet awareness that this next step was no longer procedural. And Hayes watched him go, the door closing softly behind them, leaving a space that felt slightly emptier than before, and the station continued its rhythm. But the rhythm had changed, slowed in places, sharpened in others, as if every action now carried a second layer of attention. And Hayes remained by the terminal, his gaze fixed on the screen, but his thoughts no longer aligned with the information in front of him. They moved backward, replaying the moment at the roadside, the words spoken, the tone used, the assumptions made without question, and he saw it now, not as justification, not as error alone, but as a pattern, something ingrained, something that had guided his actions without being examined. And that realization did not arrive with force, it settled quietly, like something that had always been there waiting to be acknowledged. And he shifted his stance, his reflection faintly visible in the dark edge of the monitor. And for a second, he did not recognize the version of himself looking back, not because it had changed, but because he was seeing it clearly for the first time. And across the room the door to the lieutenant's office opened again, and Morris stepped out, his expression composed but altered, the edges of certainty replaced by something more deliberate, more aware, and he walked back toward the front desk, his pace steady, not rushed, but each step carrying the weight of what had just been said behind closed doors. And Hayes straightened slightly as he approached, their eyes meeting briefly, a silent exchange passing between them, not of instruction but of understanding. And Morris stopped a few feet away, his voice low, controlled. "They are initiating a formal review," he said, and the words landed with quiet finality, not unexpected now, but no less significant. And Hayes nodded once, the motion slow, accepting, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer uncertain but defined. And the younger officer at the terminal continued working, documenting, recording, each keystroke a small acknowledgement of the process now in motion, and the station lights continued their steady hum overhead, unchanged, illuminating a space that looked the same but no longer felt it, because something had shifted beyond the surface, something that would not be undone by time or explanation. And as Hayes finally stepped back from the terminal, his hands resting briefly at his sides, he understood something with a clarity that had not been there before, that this was not about a single moment or a single mistake. It was about something deeper, something that would not be resolved quickly or easily. And that understanding settled into him quietly, without resistance, as the night moved forward and the consequences began to take shape. The station clock ticked past another minute without announcement, its quiet movement unnoticed by most, but felt by those who stood closer to the center of what had unfolded. And Officer Hayes leaned slightly against the edge of the desk now, not out of fatigue, but out of a need to anchor himself to something physical, something steady, while the weight of realization continued to settle in layers he had not expected. And Sergeant Morris remained upright near the front, his gaze shifting occasionally toward the office door, as if anticipating the next instruction, the next step in a process that no longer belonged to instinct or habit. And across the room the younger officer continued typing, documenting each detail with careful precision. The soft rhythm of the keyboard no longer background noise, but a steady reminder that everything had been recorded, preserved, placed into a system that would now examine it from angles none of them could control. And Hayes watched the screen for a moment longer before looking away, his attention drifting not outward but inward, replaying the night again, slower this time, clearer, without the urgency that had once driven it. And he saw the moment differently now, not as a sequence of correct actions, but as a chain of assumptions that had never been questioned. And that realization did not strike him sharply. It settled, like a quiet acknowledgement that could not be undone, and Morris finally stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "They want full statements by morning," he said, and Hayes nodded once, the response automatic but grounded in understanding. "Understood," he replied, though the word felt heavier now, no longer procedural but personal. And for a second they stood in silence, not the uncertain silence from earlier, but one that carried meaning, one that did not need to be filled. And the station around them continued its rhythm, officers moving, phones ringing, the structure intact. But beneath it there was a shift that could not be ignored, something subtle but persistent, like a current running just beneath the surface. And Hayes straightened slightly, his shoulders settling into a posture that no longer carried the same certainty as before, but something else, something more aware. And he looked toward Morris again, his voice quieter this time. "I did not see it," he said, not as an excuse, not as a defense, just a statement. And Morris met his gaze, holding it for a moment, before responding. "That is the problem," he said, his tone even, not harsh, not soft, just honest. And the words did not escalate. They did not accuse, they simply settled into place, and Hayes nodded, slowly, accepting them without resistance, because they aligned with what he had already begun to understand. And across the room the younger officer paused his typing briefly, glancing up at them before returning to the screen, his movements deliberate, as if he too recognized the weight of what was being recorded. And the fluorescent lights overhead continued their steady hum, illuminating everything with the same indifferent clarity, unchanged by what had happened, yet revealing it all the same. And Hayes moved away from the desk, taking a few steps across the floor, not toward anything specific, just creating space, his thoughts continuing to shift, to realign. And he stopped near the window, looking out into the dark parking lot where the night remained quiet, the same road, the same lights, but not the same moment. And he understood then that nothing about this would resolve quickly, not the report, not the review, not the understanding that had begun to take shape inside him. And that realization did not bring fear. It brought something else, something steadier, something that required acknowledgement rather than avoidance. And behind him Morris remained where he was, his posture composed, his focus already moving toward what came next, because the process had begun, and it would continue, regardless of comfort or certainty. And as Hayes stood there, the reflection of the station lights faintly visible in the glass. He did not look away, because for the first time that night, he was not trying to find an answer. He was learning to see the question. Morning did not arrive all at once. It edged its way in through the tall front windows of the station, a pale gray light replacing the artificial glow that had carried the night, and Officer Hayes stood in the same place near the glass, though the reflection staring back at him looked different now, not because his face had changed, but because something behind it had settled into a new shape, something quieter, more deliberate, and the parking lot outside remained still, a few cars scattered. Across the asphalt, the faint outline of the road stretching beyond, the same road where it had begun, yet no longer, holding the same meaning. And behind him the station had shifted into morning routine, voices a little clearer, footsteps more frequent, the rhythm of a new day layering itself over what had happened. But it did not erase it. It simply existed alongside it. And Sergeant Morris stepped out of the office once more, a folder in his hand, his posture composed, his expression carrying that same measured awareness that had settled into him hours earlier. And he paused for a second, looking across the room, not searching, just acknowledging, before walking toward Hayes. And when he stopped beside him, he did not speak immediately, the silence between them no longer uncertain but understood. And then he handed over the folder. Your statement, he said, his voice steady, and Hayes took it, the paper heavier than it should have been, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, and he opened it slowly, scanning the first lines, the official language, the structured format. Every detail placed in order, and yet none of it captured the moment the way it had been felt, the pause, the tone, the assumptions that had shaped everything before they were even recognized. And he closed it again after a second, holding it at his side, his gaze returning to the window, and Morris followed his line of sight briefly before speaking again. They will review everything, he said, not as a warning, not as reassurance, just a fact. And Hayes nodded once, his voice quiet. They should, he replied, and the words carried no resistance, only acceptance, because he understood now that this was not about avoiding consequence. It was about facing something that had been present long before this night. And across the room the younger officer finished his report, sliding the final page into a tray with careful precision, his movements deliberate, aware that what he had documented would move beyond this space, beyond this building, into something larger, something that would not forget. And the station continued its morning, calls coming in, officers stepping out, routine re-establishing itself on the surface. But beneath it, there was a quiet awareness that remained, a subtle shift. In the way eyes met, in the way pauses lingered just a little longer, and Hayes stood there a moment more, before finally stepping away from the window, his movement unhurried, his posture steady, not the same as before, but not broken either, just changed. And as he walked toward the desk to begin writing, the sound of his boots against the floor was softer now, less certain but more intentional, and he sat down, placing the folder in front of him, opening it again, and for a second he did not write. He simply looked at the page, understanding that the words he put down would not just describe what happened, they would define how he understood it. And that understanding mattered now in a way it had not before, and he picked up the pen, his grip steady, and began, not rushing, not avoiding, just writing what was true. And outside the sun continued to rise, light spreading slowly across the asphalt, across the road, across the place where everything had shifted, and somewhere far beyond the station, Naomi Carter moved forward without looking back, not because she needed to forget, but because she had never been defined by the moment at all. And inside, as Hayes wrote, the silence around him no longer felt like something to escape. It felt like something to listen to, something that carried a question he would not ignore again, because power had never been in the uniform. It had been in the ability to see. And for the first time, he was learning how.